Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody, and nice to see a lot of familiar faces. Um, as Sarah just mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about my field practicum, which I carried this summer here in Gainesville. Um, Sorry if because I have two computers. I'm using the other one as for my notes as well, so I might not be able to always like directly look at you on this computer. So I apologize for that in advance. Yeah. So the topic of my field practicum, the initial topic of my field practicum, which I developed the proposal during the summer, the title was A Historical Approach to Addressing Systemic Inequalities in Alachua County. So initially when I was working on my proposal, and although I haven't really moved away from my principal goals, it still remained the same. And the goal was to basically identify and analyze the different multiple forms of inequalities that keep especially African American marginalized community in poverty and vulnerable to crisis, like for example, the COVID pandemic, which we've all already experienced, and any other crisis. So I also had specific objectives to my field practicums, and the objective, some of the specific objectives were, for example, trying to understand like the social, but also the economic issues that affect a lot of African American community members in Alachua County, but also beyond just understanding the social and economic issues, but also the multiple forms of inequalities and the potential historical roots are linking to these inequalities. My research questions, sorry. I had developed 4 research questions. My research question, the first one was, how do people perceive gender? Because I have a big interest in gender, and I've been doing a lot of work on gender since I came here at UF.
Hey,
and so that was, yes?
Sorry, you're not sharing your screen right now.
I'm not sharing my screen?
No.
It says you are screen sharing. That's what I see here.
I see this. I see reason.
I can see the screen. The sharing
Sorry,
screen.
never mind. That's my bad then.
Okay. Okay. So my first research question was, how do people perceive gender inequality in a historical approach of race issues in Alachua County? And then the second one was also about gender, but using gender to understand the history of America, but the historical legacy of social inequalities, social economics, and political inequalities. In terms of social, I was looking at education, health, and other accesses, such as, for example, access to transport, access to recreation and any other facilities, access to housing as well. And then in terms of the economics, I was looking at access to jobs, but also what kind of jobs that were available for people here. And in terms of the political inequalities, I was looking mainly at civic engagement, how people engage in their community, and also the impact of those engagement, how transformational those engagement were. So my third question was looking also at the different races experiencing gender, how different races experience gender differently, and how does intersectionality apply to the African American community in Alachua County. So looking also at family composition, household independence, and any other characteristic that may affect how people see themselves. And then the last question was, what kind of gender experience reinforces inequality in Alachua County? As you can see, a lot of my question was centered on gender, but then as I would speak earlier, although gender was not the main issue that I was looking into, but it was also used as the foundation to also understand the other kinds of inequalities that are in Gainesville. So in terms of my field practicum, it's intended to also contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 5, which is gender equality and women and the empowerment of women and girls. as well as SDG 10, which is to reduce inequality. It also may also contribute to other SDGs, for example, like SDG 1, ending poverty, SDG 4, equality education, but also SDG 7, which is about partnership for attaining the different kinds of goals. I conducted my field practicum with the Samuel Proctor Oral History, which is based here at UF. Samuel Proctor Oral History is also known as POP, and it is a social justice research center engaging in experiential learning, which encourages civic engagement, but also they have like archive of oral histories that have been conducted for like the past 30 years, which can all be found on their website. In terms of my methods, I mainly use a qualitative approach, conducting oral history interviews, but also, of course, looking at different literatures on the topics that I was looking at, inequalities, gender, and race as well, but as well as like any other socioeconomic aspect related to inequalities in Gainesville. All of my interviews were conducted on Zoom. So far, I conducted about like 8 interviews, which were almost like 1 hour to 1.5 hours long. I used like a feminist perspective, open-ended question, trying to understand, but also having in mind what I was looking for, but also keep it open in terms of the kind of information that I wanted to receive from my participants. Yeah. I'm just going to introduce my conceptual framework, which in itself can also explain my work in a way that can be visualized. So if you can see here, I'm just going to look for the cursor. So there are 3 main components to this, to the conceptual framework, which you can see on the left-hand side. I am aware that I was aware that, for example, poverty can be assessed in many different ways, and poverty can also mean many different things to people. But then I had to narrow it and only look at a few things. So on this, inside the triangle, you will see the different manifestation of poverty, or also you can refer to them of inequality. So a different manifestation of poverty or inequalities that I focus on, and they were civic participation, access to education, both formal and informal. When I mean informal, those could be beyond any program beyond the classroom, trainings and anything else related to education or to learning experience. And then economic opportunities, this could be related to job, but anything that can improve someone's economic status, basically. And then in the Venn diagram here, basically this is the lens that I use to look at the different manifestation of poverty using an intersectionality lens, for example, unpacking the different kind of characteristics that shape one's individual experience in his or her own community. So this individual experience is shaped by what I looked at was race, the geographic location where the person lives, but as well as gender. And I used the oral history interview to assess the poverty experience faced by different individuals. So as I said earlier on, when I'm speaking about economic opportunities, for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on, in terms of, I'm going to focus on income, access, and civic participation, which are all which all relate to the different manifestation of inequalities. So before going on the next slide, I just also wanted to briefly speak about my outflow, the deliverable that I intend to produce from this practicum, which is a reflection on race and gender-based inequalities in development that hopefully can be used for policy recommendation, maybe not only in Alachua County, but in any other context where race and gender are both critical for development. So I also worked on a theory of change, which was also very critical in terms of understanding like the way forward after addressing, because if you look at my previous conceptual framework, it looks at like the issues, the main problem. So looking at another this framework allowed me, which I actually borrowed from the sources reported right below here, allowed me to look at perhaps like a way forward that can be used, a framework that can be used to address some of the issues that I mentioned earlier on. And agency is key because we need agency, because agency can change the individual experience in terms of empowerment, but also capabilities, because this framework is used a lot, especially in work on gender, on women empowerment. But I also, after analyzing and looking at it, I also adapted it to the issue of capabilities. When I mean capability, I'm looking at, for example, also I borrowed that from the work by Amartya Sen, looking at, for example, access to education, to income, and also related to the functioning of, for example, the ability to be well nourished, the ability to be housed, to receive adequate education, or even to be supported by a social network. So we have here our capabilities, which basically our agencies, our resources, and our institutional structure feed into our capabilities. But then again, agency is the key, because agency, as mentioned in Naila Kabir, who gives a very good definition of agency, which is the ability to make strategic life choices, is very key to improving one's capability, therefore improving one individual experience in her or his own community. The other also item is that in terms of agency is also shaped by institutional structures here. It could be family, community, the state, but also by the resources which are fed into the community, but also the way, for example, bodily integrity, which is a lot, again, this relates more to the literature on empowerment, but also can be relevant in this case, where how somebody sees themselves can influence one's agency. So what do we know about the current state or about inequality in Alachua County? Because that's one thing that was key or central to my field practicum research. Sorry. The first thing I would like to speak about here is just to look at the demographic of Gainesville. Many of you may be aware, but as also I see myself as I've only been in Gainesville for about a year now, so a lot of this information was also new to me. For example, in terms of the demographic, as we can see here in this diagram, it represents the different demographic groups in Alachua County. We have the majority, which are white, non-Hispanic, and then followed by Black or African American, and then Hispanic, Asians, and other ethnicities as well. The racial and ethnic dissimilarity index is very interesting because the dissimilarity index basically it gives it provides the distribution of groups among it gives an indication of the distribution of groups across different geographic area. But the dissimilarity index is also used as a measurement of segregation to see how segregated like one racial group is from another. Here, the comparison is to white, non-Hispanic. As you can see, sorry, as you can see here, the arrow is on the wrong one. As you can see, I was trying to actually put it, as you can see in 2016, which is the latest data that we have available, when you look at the similarity index in Gainesville, between black and white, in Gainesville, you can see that it's the highest among any of the different groups, meaning that the segregation between black and white is the highest in ALACHUA in Gainesville. Another aspect also related to that is, which also provided some precedent to what I'm going to speak about earlier on, is to show how the inequalities in a lot of different aspects are not evenly distributed among the different racial groups. Here you can just see that looking at poverty and child poverty in Alachua County on the first panel, you can see that the poverty rate among African American Black is the highest. It stands at 35.7%, which is almost double that of non-Hispanic white. And the poverty rate among children, African American children, is even higher than among the general population. It's the highest, which stands at almost about 40%. So I'm going to now transition and look at the socioeconomic and political inequalities. The first one that I'll look at is income. Again, here, the trend from, in the next slide, you will also observe that the trend almost remains the same. In the different variable that we'll look at, either income, asset, labor, we'll find that African Americans, again, in Alachua County or even across America or across the states, fare worse than any of the other racial groups. Here, looking at income, we see again the same disparity, where African American in Alachua County have the lowest income in comparison to the other racial groups. So people have low income for many reasons. So the next one we'll look at the labor market, perhaps can help to explain this trend. According to the research that I've done, in Alachua County, approximately 2/3 of the jobs require post-secondary vocational training or higher education. And the highest paying jobs are in the field of legal, health, management, business, technology, engineering, and science. And the labor market also shows that there's a higher unemployment rate actually for lower skilled workers. But that is not because there aren't enough low skilled jobs. I mean, there may not be enough low skilled jobs, but that's not the only reason. One of the reasons is that a lot of low skilled jobs are in construction, for example. And then the constructors that come in Gainesville come with their already team made up of workers, so they don't really employ locally. And also a lot of low-skilled jobs are given to students because they believe that students are more flexible or adapt easily to technology. But there's also another issue in terms of the skills acquired and the skills needed. And sometimes, like from the research that I've done again, for example, a lot of African Americans skills are more lean towards more the unskilled, the unskilled labor. And as I mentioned earlier, like almost 2/3 of jobs in Gainesville require some kinds of skills. So this graph here shows the unemployment rate in Alachua County, which is for African American. It stands at 14%, which is way more than any of the other racial groups. So the next thing I'm going to look at, also again related to income, because under income we also have assets. So we had labor market, and then I'm transitioning to assets. Asset, one also important characteristic to it is looking at home ownership rates. Sorry. So in terms of the home ownership rate, what we see here is the disparity is not as accentuated as in the other, as income or labor market, which we previously looked at, because we can see here that in the African American community, the home ownership rate is actually the same as that of Asians and Hispanic. But there's something beyond that. African Americans may own, for example, may have similar rates, home ownership rates to Asian and Hispanic, but that does not mean that the houses that they own, the property value of those houses are the same as the Asians or the Hispanic. So the next diagram will provide a bit more information on the property value. As you can see here in the different sub-regional location, again, looking at African American here, in the first panel under clay, we see here that the property value of home owned by African American has the lowest value, and that's the same thing in the first panel, the same thing here, and the same thing in Newberry as well. There are many reasons that can explain this trend. But some historical aspect that can also explain this trend in terms of the home ownership or the property values, going back to redlining. Redlining was the denial of some services, for example, to a subgroup population through insurance, or for example, mortgage has kept through the denial of some services such as insurance, but also mortgage. And we also have the Federal Housing Administration, which was established, for example, in 1934 with the goal to facilitate home financing and insurance. And the FHA basically rated houses according to the perceived stability, like of the neighborhood, whether one neighborhood was stable versus another. And unfortunately, a lot of neighborhoods predominantly lived by African American were rated low, which again influenced access to mortgage and further worsening the segregation or even the value of houses owned by African Americans. The other issue that is also very relevant to housing is, and this is quite a current issue that we are facing even in Gainesville, is gentrification. I just pulled out an article that was posted recently about the Seminary Lane, which if you just, I can give you a few seconds to just read what's on the screen. It used to be, it's described as a vibrant community where African American were built their own community. Like the second graph will say here, it had a school, it had a bar, so you had all the different all the different facilities that the community needed. But now this neighborhood is at risk because they may be displaced due to new development coming in the area. And one of the greatest risks is also for the current community not be able to find affordable housing and may not be able to remain in the area. So this is also one threat to home ownership. I'm now going to speak about education, which this was a topic that discussed multiple times during my interviews. Yeah, I would say like of all the interviews that I conducted, education came up as a key issue that needs to be improved, that needs to be looked at. Yeah, so just even looking at, I don't know if you can see, there's a quote that I added right on top here, that I extracted from my interview. And then the quote says, if you can't see, I'm just going to read it for you. By the time nice little white children from rich families get into grade 1, they've had a lot of cultural training and education. If you are the child of a poor Black working single mother, you get into grade 1 with nothing. And we just can't do that. We simply cannot do that. We've got to have good preschool care and education. So basically, the interview here was reflecting to the fact that the inequalities is even beyond just not having access to a good, adequate education, but the fact that there are so many disadvantages that Black children face even before starting school. So the precedent that have been set makes it hard for them to go through the system and succeed with the help of the system. So looking at the table on the right, it shows the different factors, different measurement of education that gives us some kind of indication of how the different racial groups perform in terms of education. So just by looking at the first one, which is high school graduation, the first row is our data related to Alachua County, and then the second row is related to Florida. So just by looking at the first row, we can see here that the graduation rate for African American is lower than any of the other racial group, like 66%. The same thing for school proficiencies, which this variable basically looks at the performance of fourth graders. It's again lower among African American. Looking at third graders' proficiency in reading, again, it's lower for African American. Looking at eighth graders' proficiency in math, again, it's lower for African American. So going back to the first row, high school graduation, the graduation rate also gives us an indication of the school dropouts. So a lower graduation rate means that there are more children along the educational system or later dropped out of school. And so when we look at the graph on our right-hand side, which is the birth to mothers without a high school degree, we can see here that the highest birth to mothers without a high school degree occurred among African American, either in 2010 or in 2015. It was the highest among African American. And here we can also, it's also based on the literature or the interview that I conducted, I could relate that to the fact that a lot of teenagers drop out of school because of early pregnancy, which is something that I'll speak about later on when I refer to gender aspects. I also looked at access to healthcare in terms of the under the accesses, because remember when I spoke about my conceptual framework, I had 3 manifestations of inequality: civic engagement, access to education, formal and informal economic opportunities. So although healthcare was not one issue that I looked at, not because it's as important as anything else, but due to my own limitations. So I did not delve deeper into access to healthcare. So here I just have a graph showing the uninsured rate in 2015. And it's high also among African American, but also as well as you can see, it's even higher among Hispanics for different reasons. Yeah. The other accesses that are also relevant and important are transport, recreation, and food access, which I just mentioned here, but I have not yet delved deeper into it in my practicum. One thing to mention, sorry, I'll just quickly go back in the slide, is that although all these aspects, all these services are important because they affect one's capabilities it affects basically the individual experience of a person. That's why, although I may not have yet delved deeper into the literature on these different aspects, it's also important, is an important consideration, given that it will affect the capabilities of the people. The next item is civic participation, which was one of the key points that I addressed in my conceptual framework. In civic participation, what is key to it is also agency, because agency provides people with the ability to make strategic choices, and these life choices, again, they are shaped by resources and institutional structures. For example, people cannot randomly decide what jobs they get. They cannot randomly decide what school they go to or where they live. So all these are very important. And so freedom is shaped by your income, because if you are a low income person, maybe you are more likely, for example, as an African American, to live in a certain area in Gainesville or in ALACHUA County. So your freedom is also shaped by your income, but also by the accesses that you have, like, you know, which set precedents for future economic opportunities, like your access to jobs, your access to any other services. And in freedom, what I focus on is civic participation, as participation allows one person, allows a community to basically have a voice and participate in the process of change. And so the aspect of voice is also key to the issue that I'm looking at in my field practicum. I just also took a quote from Sen, for example, saying economic freedom can breed social unfreedom, just as social or political unfreedom can also foster economic unfreedom. So going back to civic engagement, civic participation, one aspect that is also important is are the enabling conditions that allow people to participate in policies, participate in decision making. So this enabling factors can also be shaped by resources. I've spoken earlier under the theory of change, but they can also be shaped by institutional support or institutional system like family, the state, and any other related factor. So there are many sources of unfreedom that can occur to basically, that can cause barriers to civic engagement or civic participation. But one that I looked at in my practicum, or that I've looked at to this point, is, for example, the inability to participate in the justice system, or how that can shape one's freedom. And that's the next point that I will look at. So involvement in the justice system is also shaped by different, it causes a lot more issues, or it's shaped by different aspects, let me put it that way. For example, first, when somebody is convicted of felony, they have difficulties in getting jobs. Not only that they have difficulty in getting jobs, but it goes beyond that. They have their voting rights are restricted. They even have like problems or more difficulties in accessing higher education. So all of that create barriers for them to participate in the justice system. But also beyond that, it also creates for them barriers to participate in the economic system, as they cannot even get like, they cannot improve their skills to get better jobs and improve their income. So this graph here shows as the detention rate in the juvenile detention rate in 2015. We can see here, looking at the left panel, that the detention rate among African American in Alachua County is 3.7%, compared to 0.4% for white and 0.3%. So this is actually a very alarming rate, because it's way higher. It's more than double any rate of the other racial groups. And in terms of the juvenile arrest rate in 2015, that was at 16.8% for African American in Alachua County, in comparison to whites, which were at 2.5% and 2.4% for Hispanic. Looking at the right panel, we can see that the rates in Florida are also higher, but they are even a little bit lower than Alachua County. So we are actually above the average in Alachua County. So basically, all of that we've spoken about, like, for example, the access to the justice system, incarceration, they all have an implication on the social fabric of the community, but also on gender. So in terms of social network, there are a number of aspects or characteristics that shapes the social network. And these all came out through my interviews and also a review of the literature on gender and race. For example, there's the aspect of family composition, support system, safety net, which is then related to the community, to the family composition, to how, for example, one thing also that came a lot in my in the interview that I had, or even the literature, was how a lot of children are raised in single parenting household. How some men are incarcerated and are not able to participate in their community or in their families' decision-making process or system. So that in all has an impact on the safety net of the community and on the social network as a whole. There's also another quote that I extracted from my interview, which I thought was quite powerful. So the interviewee says that, I'm just gonna read what she says. So these kids that aren't well educated and aren't successful, the boys, they grow up not ready to take on good jobs. They become parents, they can't support their children, and they just bow out. And that's why we have so many single mothers abandoned. And it's not the fault of the Black male, it's the fault of society that hasn't educated and trained the Black male. So this came out in one of the interviews that I conducted with one member from the community here in Alachua County. She felt strong about how the society in itself has failed Black men here, and that it has become a systematic issue more than an individual issue. Yeah. So the next item that I'm gonna look at, it brings me closer to the gender aspect. What I will first start with is the aspect of the wage gap. The wage gap in Alachua County, in Florida, women earn about 6,700 less than men in terms of the wage gap. And very often, many of the lower income workers are from minority groups, particularly Blacks or Hispanic. So when I interviewed a former professor of nursing here in Gainesville, I asked her about the professions and positions that Black women hold. And according to her, she said that Black women held many different kinds of positions now. However, as a community, they still find it hard to have students participate, participate in the sciences. For example, she used to, like I mentioned earlier, she used to teach nursing, and she left the institution where she was teaching about 20 years ago. There has not been any increase of Black women or men being hired in that department. So back then, 20 years ago, there were 2 teachers back then, and today there are still 2 teachers in that same, two Black teachers in that same position. So she feels that there is no growth in some areas, although there has been a lot of improvement, but still there are no, in some areas there aren't enough growth. There are also many other gender-based disparities. For example, looking at, I think earlier on I mentioned of how looking at the birth to mothers without high degree education, how it was higher among African-American girls. Here we can see again that the birth to teen mothers is also higher among Black girls or Black teenagers, which has gone down between 2010 and 2015, but which is still higher in comparison to the other racial groups. Another aspect that I also wanted to touch base on was speaking about work. Because later on I'm going to bring in the historical legacy or the different key events that occur in the past that may have also an influence on the inequalities or the issues that are that we are facing currently. But there's one concept that also came up in my interviews, where the concept of latchkey kids, of how back even during slavery, even post-slavery, during the Reconstruction era, during the Jim Crow era, a lot of Black women were already part of the working force way before time, and either informally or formally. And so the fact that they were already involved in the working force without maybe the necessary support also has some impact or shapes the social network of the community. So just looking at one quote that I extracted also from one of my interviews, she said, what Black women have always had, Black women have always had latchkey kids because our mothers were at your house. So we always came home to get the key from under the mat and open the door and go in. But my mother taught us what to do once we were there. That's all she could do. She had to go to work. So when the latchkey kids evolve, now we're going to talk about what's going on with women. We can't leave Black women out. If you use this as a concept that you are working from, you have just left me out of the picture. That's how she said. So the latchkey kids should not even be a new concept, because it existed way before. As Black women during slavery were working as domestic workers. They were away from the house, so they were away from their children. The children came home unsupervised, and all of that are a set of precedents, a set of issues or events that may have had repercussions to what we are currently living today. So how did it turn out this way? So next, I'm gonna look at slavery and Reconstruction era. Slaves were not really recognized as full humans, and the same for Black women or Black men. For example, in terms of Black women, they did not even have right to control their own bodies and to grant or withhold consent. So both Black men and women were mostly considered as input to the factors of production. So they were dehumanized, they were excluded from the sphere of society during this era. During the Reconstruction era, which was a period of legal, political, and social recreation that just followed the Civil War. A lot happened, and for the first time, many Black people in the region comprised a community of voters, public officials, and landowners. But this was also a very critical moment because back then, a lot of white people refused to accept emancipation and Black citizenship. And this resulted in a lot of violence that occurred during that period to traumatize the Black communities, which I'm gonna speak more about the racial violence that occurred, because that was very central to the host institution that I work with. They were looking specifically at racial violence, at the work of memory, recognizing the past lynching that occurred in Alachua County.
Hey, Ange, we're actually at time.
Ooh. Okay. So sorry. So I'm just gonna briefly just quickly browse through this racial. So yeah, so they basically look at racial violence, the different kinds of racial violence, political violence, lynching. There were a number of lynching that occurred in Alachua County, in Gainesville as well. So they also look at the Ocoee massacre, and the goal of it was to recognize through historical markers, to recognize the lives that were lost through lynching. So this work has been led by the Truth and Reconciliation Initiative here in Gainesville through the Alachua County Remembrance Project. So they are currently still working on that. There's also the issues of reparation, which is something that is not new, but I did not delve deeper into that I have not yet delved deeper into that during my field practical. But reparation is also important because the work on truth and reconciliation may be setting precedents for further work on reparation that will happen in the future. My positionality was also very important to this process, where I'm from, what I've experienced in the past. I used to live in South Africa, also a country that had gone through apartheid, a country that was racially divided, a country that had also gone through a truth and reconciliation process, although not perfect, but South Africa went through that. So that alone, my experience in South Africa was also, I had to take into account here when I was working on my field practicum. So basically, hoping that this work can also be applied beyond Alachua County in any other context where race and gender in development is critical, and it should also reflect what is going on in different places across the country and the world right now. And that's it. And yeah, I would like to thank you, my TCD, the Latin American Studies, the Center of African Studies, for sponsoring my studies here, and the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program for being my host institution, especially Dr. Paul Ortiz, and my committee as well. Thanks.